she loves her job. If you have not signed in already, please sign in and get snacks.
Okay. You want me to-
Sure.
All right, so if anybody, I'm going to be kind of informal, so if you have any questions or anything, just stop me and ask me. But as she said, my name is Brenda Mueller, and I teach psychology here at OJC. I'll kind of be explaining as we go through some of the training and stuff that I've had. So I thought this was sort of humorous, because psychology is one of the most misspelled words. And I actually noticed that on when people turn in term papers, they will, I don't know if they spell check everything except psychology, but I often have students misspelling psychology too.
They just ignore that word to drive you crazy.
Yes.
Probably.
So it's those ologies, they get them confused. But so the first step in psychology is actually learn how to spell it. So that is step one. Okay. And then when people ask me how I get into psychology, this is actually me. That's the last good photograph I ever took. But I said I was writing down notes about my family. I wasn't really doing that. But my older sister is like 7 years older, and so I guess I was in upper elementary school and she was in high school taking psychology. She would come home and tell me about what they learned in psychology that day. And she was like so excited about it. And she went on to go into being a dental hygienist, but she sparked my imagination, at least, that I really thought it was interesting. So I kind of kept pursuing psychology. And again, there's a lot of these misconceptions. So we really aren't analyzing people all the time. I used to have people ask me that all the time when I was in school. Oh, are you reading my mind? Are you analyzing me? But I sort of like that. So just, you have to keep a sense of humor. So if you can make people worry about it a little bit, keeps them on their toes. And this is where I went to school. I actually grew up in Iowa. So I got my bachelor's and my master's at the University of Northern Iowa, which is in Cedar Falls, Iowa. As far as a recent claim to fame, they were in the Sweet 16, or they made it part way, but they're not in the Final Four. But they got a little ways. So as I said, I got my bachelor's in psychology, and then I started to get my master's in counseling, and it's not that I didn't like counseling, but I didn't necessarily like the program. And then I had the chance, they started a psychology program with a clinical emphasis for master's degree. So I kind of switched master's degree and got my master's in psychology rather than counseling. And then, oh, you can turn, sorry. And then I also, when I tell you about my career field, so I started out with a master's in psychology, and originally thought that my goal was to be a therapist and be involved in counseling, and worked a couple years in mental health. But then I decided that working in education would also be a good idea. So I actually went back to University of Colorado at Denver. And at that time, it was basically, I had to take like 34 hours, so it's almost like doing another master's. But I got a license in school psychology. Now they still have the program there, but it's an education specialist. So when I did it, it was a little bit different. I could just have the hours beyond my master's in order to get licensed in Colorado as a school psychologist. So at the time I was doing that, I was also working full-time as a school psychologist, because I was on, and I was looking at you because I know your mom did some of that too. So on a temporary basis, like I had temporary eligibility since I already had my master's. So I was working full-time and taking summer classes, and at that time they didn't have online classes because this has been a few years ago. So So in the summer I took classes in Denver, and they had a program that you would go on weekends. So I did a lot of weekends, things like that to get my degree. And in the meantime, I was working and also had 2 children while I was in school. So I guess I can relate to the students who are in that position. On the other hand, I still tell them they need to come to class because it is important, keeping that balance between family and school. Picture the page. So with grad school, I wish there was more students here. It's really important to emphasize to them that they need to get their grades up, especially going into psychology, because grades are always important, but most careers in psychology, you're going to be applying to master's or maybe even doctoral programs. So students really need to have those good grades and do well. And I just listed some of the classes that I took, but without listing all of them, like personality psychology, assessment, industrial psychology, human growth and development, which I teach now. We also called it developmental psychology when I was in school, but it was development of the lifespan. So sometimes the classes are worded a little different. And a lot of times I tell students that each chapter in the psychology book could actually be a whole course. So the Psych 101 is kind of the sampler platter, so each of those things really would be a course in psychology. And for students, I really encourage them to volunteer, because really the entry-level things that you can do in human services, you probably need to volunteer for to get that experience. So I really encourage them both for the experience, but applying to grad schools in the future and applying even for jobs. It's really important to do that. And some of the things. Okay, you're right. So as you're in psychology in grad school, that was just sort of a humorous one. But of what people think you do and what you really do.
I have one of those for librarians.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's looking to have it for a lot of. And sometimes I think people think that like psychology, you're going to read minds or look in a crystal ball or something crazy like that. They don't really see it as a science. I don't know, the bottom one, what I think I do is part of the Milgram experiment. So we sort of imagine that we're out there doing these important experiments in psychology, which they do. But there's also just a lot of actually studying and writing lots of papers. I think all things I've learned have helped, but being able to write, psychologists have to write a lot of reports. So that's one of the big things I think that I have used a great deal, is being able to write reports, not just in school, but when I was out of school, especially when I was working as a school psychologist and working in mental health, you always have to write a report about each client you see, write progress reports. So the writing is really an important aspect also. And I kind of already said this, but that was my degree. That technically my master's is from UNI, so that's where I claim is the school I came from. But I also attended UCD to get those educational psychology classes. And just to kind of talk about my career path, sort of what led me to OJC, I guess, in a roundabout way. You can go ahead and go to the next one, sorry. So some of my early experiences were being a graduate assistant, which really helped with getting my master's, because at the time it was like, I think I got like $300 a month to live on or something. It wasn't hardly anything, but of course it went farther back in the day. But it did pay, like the graduate assistantship paid my tuition and gave you a little stipend to live on. Probably not to completely live on, you still kind of had to supplement that. But that helped me pay for my master's, but also gave me a lot of experience. They'd like assign me to a different professor every semester, and you did research with them, helped run subjects for their work, that type of thing. I also, as I said, and actually as a volunteer, but I worked as camp counselors, working with people with disabilities. And there was one group, again, it's hard for people to relate because mental health has changed so much, but it was, in the early 80s, that there was a big deinstitutionalization movement in mental health. So prior to that time, a lot of people that had mental illness really did live just in a residential, often in like a nursing home type thing. People that were mentally ill were locked up, so to speak, if they had a severe diagnosis. There also was not as many medications and treatments as there are today. But in the early 80s, there was sort of that change that we wanted to get these people out and living in the community, which was a good goal. And it was really amazing to me. I can remember this one gentleman that I used to work with that I believe he was probably about 60 and had spent almost his whole life in an institution. He had been in a mental institution since he was like 18 or 19 years old. So just that institutionalized behavior, you're so used to not having to do things for yourself or being on a schedule. So we used to help them find housing, but we would teach them, it was a bigger city, so there was buses. We would teach them how to use the bus, how to read the bus schedule, how to buy groceries. We did things like that. So it was really interesting, and I think it was helpful for those people at the time. I don't know about the long-term results, but unfortunately, that's a whole nother story, but I think it sort of led to a lot of the mentally ill homeless people now also, because the institutions aren't there. So there was both good and bad with that, but I had a small part, but I did work with those clients. And I also, Colorado Boys Ranch is no longer there, but I also did the summer program there for adolescent boys who, some of them had been in trouble with the law, but some of them just had emotional problems or family problems. We're there for various reasons, and we did activities. And then my first big job was, it used to be called Family Guidance, but now it's the Southeast Health Group, same place, just they've changed names. So my first job, when I had my master's, was working in mental health. And I worked there a little over 2 years, and half of my day or my hours were seeing outpatient clients. So I'd work with a lot of adults, but also counseling with some kids and occasionally families. And then half of my day, they used to have an extended care program, which meant people with, at that time they called them chronically mentally ill, but diagnoses like schizophrenia or bipolar, people that were not able to live independently. Some of them, they used to actually have a halfway house that were there, so people were released from the state hospital, sometimes they would stay there for a while. Some people lived in the community but were on a psychiatric commitment, so they would come in during the day to check in. And I actually, as I was doing that, I really loved that half of my day a lot more than doing counseling with individuals. I really liked doing the group things. Maybe that was, I knew education was a calling. And nothing against counseling, but I think sometimes, people envision psychology as you just want to sit and talk to one person and you're going to give them advice on their problems or something. But it's really a lot more diverse than that. And I really enjoyed more of the mental disorders aspect of it and working with the larger groups. Oh, and this is in counseling, what people think we do. And I tried in my classes really talk about psychology really is a science. There are ways that we measure it, and so it's not just a bunch of voodoo, that we try to be very scientific. But in reality, no matter what you go into, there's a certain amount of paperwork and record keeping. And with Medicaid and insurance and all that, it's probably even more than when I was doing it. It keeps increasing. Would you have, if anybody has questions, stop me as I'm rattling on. So then, after I was in mental health for a while, there's a few different reasons, but there was a job opening for a school psychologist, and I did have not a lot of experience, but I did have a little experience. I'd had training in educational testing and giving IQ tests and that type of thing. When I originally took the job, now 25 years ago, it was doing a lot of testing, but I also had to go back and get more training in educational side. So the reason I put those, like I've worked with all the schools in Lahana, Los Animas, Swig, also like some preschools like the CDS, various places. Occasionally I've done some things for other school districts. I jokingly called it rent-a-psych because the BOCES, the whole principle of it is most of these small and rural areas, they can't afford each school to hire their own psychologist and their own physical therapist and their own occupational therapist or like a teacher of the hearing impaired. So they contract all those services through the BOCES. So usually I was at one school each day. So I would travel from school to school and had, like I said, occasionally preschool, but usually K through 12, which gave me kind of a broad perspective. And I did a lot of testing, but it's also sort of evolving into more consultations, like lots of behavior plans, so helping kids do better in the classroom, maybe consulting with teachers and with parents, going in, even had like a little, I didn't make it, but there's like computerized programs where we monitor their behavior and it'll chart when the behavior is happening, that type of thing. So those are some of the things that I did as a school psychologist, and sometimes social skills groups. I think one of the first groups that I ever did, I don't know what I was thinking, so I thought it would be a good idea to pick the junior high students, and then the ones who were having a lot of social problems, they would be the ones in my group. Unfortunately, if you've worked much with junior high kids, and if they don't have good social skills to start with, they don't work well together. It probably would have been smarter to include them in not try to segregate out that group. You know, later we did more inclusion things, like what are things we can do for the whole classroom. So sort of change some of the philosophies. And lots of, if you don't know what an IEP is, it stands for an individualized education plan. So if a child has been identified with a disability, we both do the testing to help identify them and then also kind of monitoring their progress as they go along. Oh, and here was what school psychologists do. So, look at that yourself. Oh, again, what I actually do, still a lot of paperwork there. Even with grading papers, there was more paperwork at BOCES even than OJC, so this has actually kind of been a nice break, but lots of paperwork.
Just get to read all the papers.
Yes, I make other people do the paperwork now, so. And then I taught part-time, while I was working as a school psychologist, I taught part-time for OJC for a lot of years, I think like about 10 years. And I also taught a few classes for Adams State through the READ program. I've taught educational psychology, and there was like a behavior management or classroom management type course from the school psychologist's point of view. So I've taught some of that too. You can go ahead. Ding. Oh. So maybe the other professors can relate to that. So this is what people think you do as a college professor. Although I have to say what I actually do is probably not that much paperwork, but some of the other things might. And sometimes I think things are very well orchestrated and planned, but it doesn't always go that way. But that's always my goal. And I said, I really like being here. And it was really a nice change to come from part-time to full-time and being able to teach during the day. And even those night classes, not that it was a bad thing, but I really enjoy being able to break that up. I feel like I get to know the students a lot better now too, because sometimes when I only saw them once a week, or if they're absent, then it's a whole nother week before I saw them again. So I feel like I've been able to build better relationships since I'm here on campus more and getting to know the students a little bit more. And then, sorry that I'm like looking over my shoulder, but these are just all possible careers in psychology. So it's kind of that degree that you can do everything with, or you can do nothing with, because it just depends on how you use it. There's so many diverse ways that you can go into psychology. So some of the, we typically think of someone being a counselor, doing therapy when you think about psychology. But there's all these other jobs too, even like financial aid, customer service, working in businesses. So there's lots of different ways that people can go into psychology if they have an interest. Yes?
Just with a bachelor's degree? Because I know that a lot of general, psychology, anthropology, the conception is that with a bachelor's, you don't necessarily get to a job, and you're always almost required to get a master's. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree. Like a lot of the jobs there is, in fact, I should have put a slide in, but as far as I would say a bachelor's level would probably be one of the minimums. But, things like you have to be a little more creative. But like being a case manager at a mental health center. I know like the Health Navigator program that they have here, I think there's a lot of overlap with that too. So if you're doing anything in human services, so you might be working to be a social worker where you're actually doing interventions, you would have to have a master's, but you could do some things with a bachelor's.
And do you play with your minors maybe?
Actually, my minor was in sociology. Actually, this is the most similar to psychology. It's like, yeah, that sounds interesting. And depending on what area you wanted to go into, though, because you might want to, if you were more interested in industrial organizational psychology, it might make more sense to have a minor in business or something. So, depending on what area you're in. And these are, I looked up, and some of these were somewhat new information to me, just like the top 10 jobs related to psychology. And number 1 was being a vocational counselor. See, I'm the right one. So there's a lot of demand for that. Again, sometimes people don't always think about, working for a college or doing admissions, things like that is related to psychology. But that can be an area. And then the school psychologist, I already talked about that one quite a bit, but I think their role is changing somewhat in that they're doing more and more, they're realizing people in psychology are good at data collection and at studying things scientifically. So if we're looking at how do we get test scores up for kids, how do we get kids to perform better in the classroom, sort of makes sense that we also need a lot of psychology in that field. So, some areas, education is still a tough area, but there are a lot of jobs in school psychology. Usually, if you're going to go into school psychology right now, you would probably need to have an educational specialist degree, which is a little bit beyond a master's or perhaps a PhD, most of them have. So as far as you might be able to get experience like with the bachelor's being a paraprofessional or helping special education students, and sometimes in between times those are good things to do too before going on. You can go ahead and turn it. And I was going to say, that was, I have to say, a little bit of motivation to become a school psychologist is they have a school schedule, at least around here. So I had summers off, which was a big perk for me with also being a mom. So I liked having summer and spring breaks off. And it was sort of funny, maybe teachers feel this way too sometimes. Sometimes by May, you're like, oh, I can't do this anymore. And then by fall, you have some weeks like, yay, I love this, let's get back into it, And I think that's what kept me going for a long time, was having that break. Because I think there is a lot of burnout, especially dealing with humans, but especially dealing in psychology. I think sometimes people that are in, mental health or those type of fields, when you just never get those breaks, it's hard. So I think maybe education gave us a little benefit in the school psychology that you get a few more breaks for your own mental health. And then a counselor, and you have to, it depends on the state really, what the requirements are. So I always tell students when we're studying about psychology, you have to be a savvy consumer, because some counselors are very well qualified. Some people can put up a shingle and call themselves a life coach, or I'm not saying this to all life coaches, but they can call themselves, a life therapist, or whatever it is, or a social specialist, without necessarily having any credentials. So if you were going to go to a therapist, or if you're working with someone, you really want to know what kind of schooling did they have, are they licensed? So through K through 12 for the schools, like I said, they're really strict about the licensure. In private practice, or I guess this is on another one, but as far as using the title psychologist, that's kind of a protected title. You can't call yourself a psychologist unless you have that PhD in psychology. So if you don't have the credentials, you can't just go out and say you're a psychologist, because that'd be like saying I'm a doctor or something. You're not. But there's a lot of in psychology sort of branches off of that. And again, not that all those people are doing bad things, it's just lots of different fields. So, just like in healthcare and anything else, there's a lot of different approaches you can take. And if you're an informed consumer, that's probably fine. But just knowing that, what you really want to do, I would say always having the degree is best. And then a genetics counselor. I thought this was really interesting that it's that far up. It's number 4 in psychology. But if you think about people are having children later and later, there's more technology to investigate possible genetic things. So there's a lot of opportunities to go into genetic counseling as well, working with people who are trying to conceive or planning their families.
Do you know Donna Cephas?
Yes.
Her oldest daughter is a genetic counselor in Seattle.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, okay. How interesting.
She loves her job.
And she likes it. Okay.
Probably, yeah.
And then, okay, the cast of CSI, I think they helped recruit a lot of people for forensic, or not CSI, sorry, Criminal Minds, sorry, it slipped. So there's a lot of shows on TV right now that have to do with forensic psychology. But it still is a good field to get into. It isn't always exactly like people imagine, that you're going to get called to all these crime scenes and be doing this profiling. I was sort of lucky. I remember one of my daughter, when she was really young, she wanted to be a crime scene investigator, but limit her practice to swing. May not be too busy, but so she's since changed her career plan. But So depending on where you live, there may be a lot more demand for it. But if you also think about forensic psychologists also interviewing witnesses in child custody cases, working within the legal system, there are a lot of job opportunities there. It just may not be, quite the same as you envisioned on TV. But I think that's with a lot of fields, you almost have to kind of get into it, and there's probably people who are specialized. And of course, definitely some people are criminal profilers. It's not that no one is, but there's probably not the largest percentage of jobs there.
But the TV shows don't show all the paperwork either.
Yeah, you just get to run around and do fun stuff. And then an engineering psychologist, again, not an area people traditionally would think of as psychology, but what can help make us more productive in the workplace, what can help people excel, like consumer products, etc. I always like watching Shark Tank stuff, because in Shark Tank, they're not always psychologists, but it does kind of relate to psychology, because they're trying to solve a problem that someone has, and maybe being an inventor or something like that. So that can also overlap into psychology. And then a clinical psychologist, kind of what most people think of as a psychologist. As I said, as far as that's one title that's protected, that to call yourself a clinical psychologist, you have to have a PhD. The one exception is a school psychologist, that school psychologists also are called psychologists. But other than that, most people are a therapist or a counselor if you have a master's. So, and again, graduate schools for clinical psych are very competitive, so getting into those PhD programs takes a lot of work. And then a sports psychologist. I've had a lot of students expressing interest in this lately. I think and it's probably a good field to get into with the way healthcare is growing. So they could work in universities. Actually had a niece that worked with a professional team. Again, lots of ways to help manage their stress. Sometimes using biofeedback, things like that. Dealing with somewhat the injury and recovery, that type of thing too. So I think there's a lot of overlap in sports and in healthcare. And then the industrial organizational psychologist. So again, that's what I was saying, maybe business or something with that, but working for, it could be an advertising agency, it could be which employees are the best employees to hire, how can we motivate our staff to work together better, or to be more productive in the workplace. So even looking at time management studies, how much time do people spend on their email or on various other things. We could really do study in the workplace to make the workplace hopefully a better place and a more productive place. And then this one people don't typically think of special, and this says special education teacher. I really think other fields in education as well, but you're also working directly with kids who maybe have disabilities, or getting to use a lot of the social emotional skills and training, do a lot of problem solving with kids with behavior or emotional disabilities. And I think we're seeing more and more in the schools, again, kind of with that deinstitutionalization movement. I was talking about adults, but it also applies to children, because it used to be that children who had disabilities often did not go to public school. They either didn't go to school at all, or they maybe went to a private facility, or they were in a home or something. But now, those children are in public school. So we really need people who are trained in lots of different disabilities to work with children in public schools as well as private schools and other settings. But there's more of a demand than there used to be.
They used to have the terms educational, or what was it? Educable, mentally handicapped, and trainable.
Yes.
Handicapped. So even though they were in the regular schools, they were in their own room, and they had those titles.
And it really has, like, even just because I'm familiar, like, with La Junta, like years ago, at the community center, they used to have like a day program for students that had more severe disabilities. But as with the inclusion movement, they really have moved those kids. And first it was into a special classroom. But now, I mean, there's always an exception, but usually in the regular classrooms that they want to include those children, you know, in the broader services. So they're not separated as these kids go to this school, these kids go to this classroom, whatever.
Do the teachers get special training?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. Usually, a special education teacher would have a master's degree. So sometimes they might have, a lot of times they have their first degree maybe in education. And I kind of, but especially working in education, a lot of times like elementary ed, and then with their master's like in special ed.
So let's say if the kid in La Junta had a learning difference and he was put with the general public in the classroom, would we make sure that he goes with a teacher that has something that had a training?
That had the
special-
training.
Yeah.
Well, usually, probably the classroom teacher, like not, of course, not every classroom teacher has it. So the special ed teachers almost become more consultants. So they might be working with that classroom teacher, like how do we modify things for this kid, or how would he learn the best? And they may be pulling them out or doing some reading groups or going in the classroom and doing things. But even kids like, let's say with a hearing loss, we might have a hearing specialist come in, and they're not with the child all day, but they're consulting with them, giving the teacher advice, here's how you can modify this lesson for a kid with a hearing impairment, etc. And if it's like, always promoting psychology club, you know. But even if you don't want to join psychology club, on Facebook, I have a website for OJC Psychology Club, and I try to just share things every day that relate to psychology, and I really try to pick out things that are like sometimes in the news or that's interesting, like just recently with the plane crash over in Germany, that he had been experiencing some depression and that type of thing. So I think psychology always applies to world events. So I, try to share those things. So if other people are interested in psychology, like us on Facebook. So, and also kind of get that discussion going. So that's all. What, do you have questions or anything?
I wanted to make a comment because you were talking about where they used to have the people institutionalized. And I lived in a town in Illinois where we did have a state mental hospital. And we were about 100 miles from Chicago. And there was all this talk about people in Chicago had children that they didn't want for whatever reason and would send them
To that.
and actually there's actually one movie, or it was a special or something, about a lady who actually was sent there and really did not have any disabilities at all. But she was institutionalized, and she was around everybody else, but finally they figured out that she really didn't belong there.
Yeah, there's always those horror stories that, well, sometimes people as children that we know sometimes a disability may look more severe, at birth, but that child does do better, or your family could commit you. So if your husband wanted you to be committed, or you were had difficulty with your teenager, you could get them committed a lot more easily in those days, and they possibly could be locked up for most of their life, which is
Sometimes
really
it's
sad.
just a physical disability, but like they couldn't hear or something like that.
And a lot of times, like people with Down syndrome, they were encouraged to leave those children at institutions rather than raising them. So I was thinking, well, my idea of within history is always like within the last 100 years is recent. But how much times have changed, even in our lifetime. Did you have a question too?
About the engineering psychologist. But they also be the kind of person who, like, the person on the team who tries to keep, like, say we're working on a project, but they're the one who tries to keep morale up, and also trying to get communication between like the lead or the advisor and the workers, and trying to keep communication between all of them.
Right, yeah, definitely like that industrial organizational psychologist working in business, because we know that, and you know, even doing in services or that type of thing, but if workplace morale is bad or things are not going well, it's not a productive place to work, and the employees aren't if they're not happy, they're not healthy either. So it could definitely, you know, keep spreading. So you could definitely do a lot of those things in the industrial psych. Questions? Okay, well, thank you for listening. I appreciate it.